Smoke drifts across a shell-torn field somewhere near St. Lo, July 1944. A U.S. tractor used for hauling a 105mm howitzer lies twisted, radiator split open, gears half melted. Mechanics have already given up. Then a thin, mud-streaked farm boy, 18, civilian patch on his sleeve, steps from a trench and wipes his hands on his overalls. "Give me 10 minutes," he says quietly. No one answers. Shells still fall in the distance, but he kneels anyway, prying at the bent linkage with a piece of wire. Oil mixes with blood on his knuckles. The soldiers watch in silence as he twists, wedges, and reconnects a cracked fuel line with the stem of his own canteen. The engine coughs, once, twice, then roars alive. A tired corporal laughs, half crying. An older sergeant mutters, "Kid, you just saved 100 lives." Around them, artillery crews swing their guns back into position. Convoys begin to move. It is not the tractor that has been rescued. It is the will of men who had almost given up. If you value stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps preserve forgotten chapters of history. Tell us where you're watching from and what time it is right now. He never studied mechanics. He had no diploma, no manuals, no teachers. Yet every sound of an engine spoke to him like a pulse under the skin. In the camp workshop behind the supply depot near Cherbourg, he would close his eyes when others reached for tools. A sergeant once teased him, asking if he prayed to machines. He smiled faintly and answered, "No, sir, I just listen." There was something uncanny about the way he could sense failure before it happened. When the old case tractor shuddered under load, he touched the frame and said, "She's breathing wrong." The men laughed until the next day when a piston cracked exactly as he had predicted. It wasn't superstition, it was memory. He had grown up on a Kansas wheat farm where every sound mattered. A cough in the motor could mean a ruined harvest, a delay before rain, a family going hungry. That was where his education began, not in diagrams, but in consequences. Sometimes, late at night, he stayed behind after curfew. The smell of gasoline and sweat lingered in the air. He would tighten a bolt, then pause and whisper as if calming a horse. The other men called it talking to ghosts. But slowly, they stopped laughing. Machines that passed through his hands lasted longer, pulled harder, and broke less. He could feel the rhythm of steel like a heartbeat. Word spread beyond the unit. A lieutenant from the Ordnance department visited the site, curious about this young civilian who could hear metal think. He observed silently as the boy tuned a carburetor by ear, no instruments, no gauges. The engine came alive with a deep, even rumble. The lieutenant simply nodded and said, "Keep him close." In that moment, the boy's gift stopped being a curiosity. It became a language of survival. He wasn't fixing machines anymore. He was restoring faith to men who saw too much death. Each vibration, each hum, each returning breath of an engine whispered that order still existed in a world falling apart. The soldiers started to listen too. Some said they could hear it, the faint human tone behind the clatter of pistons. In the stillness before dawn, when the last weld cooled and the wind rolled through the trees, it almost sounded like breathing. Winter of 1944 brought hunger even to the American camps in France. Fuel was rationed, parts delayed, and soldiers worked with machines that had outlived their limits. The boy, now called Kansas by the men, looked at a tractor dying from overheating. Its radiator leaked like a sieve. The official repair kit had run out weeks ago. Everyone expected him to give up. Instead, he walked to the scrap pile behind the mess tent. He returned with wire stripped from a fence, a dented milk can, and an oil-stained rag. The men watched in disbelief as he shaped the can into a funnel, stitched it to the radiator's side with fence wire, and wrapped the joint with the rag soaked in grease. "That'll never hold," someone muttered. But Kansas kept working, tightening, sealing, whispering something no one could hear. When he poured in water, it didn't leak. When he started the engine, it ran cooler than before. The soldiers laughed and clapped, but the laughter had awe in it. What he built wasn't just a patch. It was a message that ingenuity could be stronger than shortage. They called it the impossible fix, half in jest, half in reverence. Later that night, he sat by the fire, eating cold beans from the same can he had sacrificed. In his small notebook, he wrote a line that would survive the war. "You can't feed men on hope alone, but you can build it." The words appeared decades later in a footnote of an Army Ordnance report, credited only to an unidentified field mechanic. By dawn, his invention spread from one motor pool to another. Within a week, improvised cooling systems made from ration tins and salvaged wire appeared in 3 different divisions. What began as hunger-driven desperation became a field-wide adaptation, unofficial but unstoppable. The Army called it Field Cooling Modification No. 3, but to those who saw it happen, it was proof that even scarcity could give birth to genius. Kansas didn't care about titles. He was just relieved the engines could run, that soldiers could move again. In the ruins of Europe, where metal was worth more than names, his act became a whisper of defiance. Some nights, when the wind blew through the twisted wrecks, it sounded almost like applause. Soft, uneven, but real. By the spring of 1945, the front lines near the Rhine had turned into a swamp of mud and smoke. Convoys were trapped axle deep, and the sound of engines drowning filled the air. Among them stood the same patched tractor, Kansas's machine, the one he had refused to abandon. Its paint was chipped, its frame scarred with bullet marks, but it still breathed like a living thing. The soldiers had started giving it a name, Old Faithful. They said it pulled when nothing else would. That day, when rain swallowed the roads and every vehicle sank, Kansas climbed onto the seat and tightened his jaw. "Let's move her," he said. Men tied ropes from the tractor's hitch to the first howitzer carriage, then another and another. The engine groaned, the mud hissed, and slowly, inch by inch, the guns began to roll free. Cheers broke through the thunder. One private shouted, "If that farm kid can do this, maybe we'll get home too." It wasn't just about steel or horsepower anymore. The sight of that battered tractor dragging tons of metal through the rain became something sacred. The men began to believe that survival was still possible, that endurance was not madness. In letters written later that week, soldiers described a strange miracle, a machine that refused to die. Some even tied small ribbons to the tractor's wheel housing, as if blessing it before each march. For them, it symbolized everything human that war tried to erase: persistence, faith, and the stubborn pulse of life beneath the mud. At night, when the engines cooled and the rain softened, Kansas sat beside the machine, listening to the ticking metal. He would run his hand across the dented hood and whisper, "You did good, girl." Around him, the men shared rations, swapped jokes, and stopped talking about death for a while. The tractor had pulled more than artillery. It had pulled their hearts back from despair. No metal, no order, no speech could match what they felt that day. In a world made of chaos, one patched engine had given them rhythm again. The end came without warning. A fragment from a mortar shell tore through the air near Remagen Bridge and struck the supply convoy. When the smoke cleared, the tractor still rumbled faintly, gears grinding, but the boy who kept it alive lay motionless beside it. His hands were black with oil, as if even in his final moment he had tried to reach for a wrench. The men carried him to the roadside, silent. Someone searched his pocket for identification and instead found a small, folded letter stained with fuel. The envelope read, "To Dad, when I get a chance." Inside were only a few lines written in pencil, the kind of writing that fades but never disappears. "Tell Dad I just fixed something big. It's not the farm, but it matters. I'll bring the sound home." That night, the men gathered around the tractor. The engine had stopped. Its last breath hung in the air like smoke. A corporal began to read the letter aloud, his voice breaking halfway through. The words echoed against the metal and the dying firelight. No music played. Only the creak of cooling steel and the whisper of rain filled the silence. They buried him near a hedgerow, marking the grave with the same wrench he had used to save them weeks earlier. One man scratched a line on the handle. "He fixed us too." For a while, no one spoke. They simply stood, listening to the night. In an official report filed days later, his name appeared once, misspelled, almost lost among numbers. The note read, "Civilian mechanic, deceased, contributed to vehicle recovery operations." But for the soldiers who had seen him work, that line carried the weight of a medal. Long after, when the engine started again, the men swore they could still hear him. Each time the tractor turned over, a brief stutter in the ignition made them glance up. It was nothing more than a misfire, but to those who knew, it sounded like a heartbeat. Tell me, if you were that soldier standing in the rain, reading his letter under flickering light, what would you write back to his father? 2 weeks after his death, rain once again drowned the roads of Western Germany. A column of transport trucks lay stranded near Cologne, unable to deliver ammunition and food to the 9th Infantry Division pinned on the outskirts. Engines flooded, wheels buried. The officers argued through the night until a young sergeant remembered the boy's notebook, rescued from his duffel bag before burial. In its pages were sketches of his improvised cooling system, gear ratios, and a note scribbled in the margin. If she can breathe, she can move. At dawn, they decided to try. Mechanics tore open ration tins, bent them into funnels, and bound them with field wire exactly as the boy had done. Within hours, a dozen tractors roared back to life, dragging stranded vehicles through the mud. One after another, the guns followed. By nightfall, the convoy reached the division in time. The battle that was predicted to collapse by morning held firm. No general mentioned it in dispatches. No citation was issued. But among the soldiers, the story spread like folklore. A dead farm boy whose idea saved an army. They said he'd found a way to make machines breathe underwater, that his spirit rode with the tractors through the rain. Whether anyone believed it didn't matter. The fact remained, his impossible fix had changed the course of a fight. Weeks later, when the Ordnance Department reviewed field reports, they found a short entry among hundreds of pages. It read simply, "Field modification, source unknown." No signature, no location, just a note of function and success. And that line, lost between paragraphs of logistics, became his invisible medal. After the war, engineers traced the design through maintenance channels and used its principle for new transport prototypes. They never found his name. They called it adaptive coolant cycling, and it appeared in manuals from 1946 onward. But in truth, it had begun in hunger, in mud, and in the steady hands of a boy who refused to let an engine die. Sometimes history remembers inventions, but forgets inventors. Sometimes the smallest act, fixing a broken line, saving one convoy, echoes further than gunfire. If you were the one filing that report, would you have written his name or left it blank as they did? Years passed. The war ended, Europe began to rebuild, and the world moved on. In 1952, at a small agricultural museum in Topeka, Kansas, an old tractor sat in the corner of a dusty exhibit hall. The paint had peeled away, revealing the metal beneath, scarred and beautiful. Children ran past without noticing. Only one old mechanic paused, resting his hand on the hood. The plate read, "Model 1942, Allis-Chalmers, donated anonymously." When the caretaker tried to start it for the first time in decades, the machine coughed, hesitated, and then came alive. Its slow, rhythmic chug filled the hall like the breath of an ancient creature. On the side of the engine, carved crudely with a pocket knife, were 5 uneven words. "Don't quit till it breathes again." No one knew who had written them, but for the veterans who visited, it was enough. Some stood silently with tears they didn't expect, hearing again the voice of a boy they barely remembered. For them, that old tractor wasn't a relic. It was a survivor. It had outlived the war, the fear, the hunger, and even the man who gave it life. Across the ocean, in Germany, engineers restoring post-war farms found American tractors arriving through the Marshall Plan. Many bore cooling systems nearly identical to the impossible fix of 1944. They worked without fail. Farmers called them machines that breathe. No one could explain why the design was so reliable. It simply worked. Somewhere between Kansas and the Rhine, between a boy's muddy hands and a world learning to rebuild, the spirit of that first repair kept moving, quietly, endlessly. A single act of persistence had outlasted everything that tried to break it. As the museum lights dimmed that evening, the engine ticked in the silence, then steadied into a calm, even rhythm. Outside, wind swept through the wheat fields, carrying the same sound he once listened for, the heartbeat of a world refusing to stop. History often hides its truest victories in the quiet corners, not in medals, not in monuments, but in the stubborn breath of a machine that should have died long ago. The boy who fixed the tractor did more than repair steel. He He reminded a generation that resilience is not born from strength, but from refusal. The refusal to give up when the world collapses. The refusal to let silence replace heartbeat. Every great factory, every battlefield, every liberated village depended on acts like his. Anonymous, unrecorded, ordinary miracles that turned desperation into movement. He never commanded troops or designed weapons, yet his 10-minute repair outlasted all the thunder of artillery. What he created wasn't a machine. It was a bridge between survival and belief. Proof that even in war, creation could still defeat destruction. Decades later, when engines start in distant fields and the rhythm hums steady under the sky, his presence lingers there. You can almost hear him in the sound of pistons and wind, whispering through time, "Don't quit till it breathes again." And perhaps that is the message we were meant to inherit, that endurance, not glory, is the true measure of courage. Somewhere tonight, a machine turns over in the dark, its first spark echoing a promise made in mud and blood. It breathes because someone once refused to stop listening.